You ever want to know what it sounds like inside of my head? That it's something like that. Matthew chapter 25, beginning of verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me. Naked and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you?" Then he will answer them saying, "Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Now, one of the things, if not the thing, that we seek to do with this series over the next few weeks is actually not preach a series of political messages, but rather just to leverage the conversation that is being amplified right now in political spectrums, those messages that intersect with the gospel, and allow us to lift up the gospel as a banner held higher than any other conversation in our lives, and maybe, possibly, hopefully, that message be louder than all the other messages that are around us, so that we personally, as the church, can stand firm on the foundation of the gospel of God. For no matter what happens around us, it is the gospel upon which we stand. No matter what happens around us, it is the kingdom within which where our faith is found. I do not move left or right because of what surrounds me, but rather because of the word of the Lord before me, I walk forward. And so when we understand this, there is something greater that awakens our faith than what surrounds us that awakens our fears. So first and foremost, before there were any nations gathered, we must understand that it was Jesus who came and he sat on his throne. Before there is anything of consequence or significance on an eternal scale, it is Jesus, it is Christ, and Christ alone who will come, who will return, and he will sit on his throne to judge the nations. And so we as the church have a message that we must lift up louder and higher, and that is that Jesus Christ is coming back. I know there are a lot of other things that are happening. I know there are a lot of other things that are in front of us, but the biggest thing that is in front of us is that Jesus is coming back. And so when we recognize that he is coming, then it is his coming that we prepare for, greater than anything else. There are people who do not believe that Jesus is coming. There are people who believe, for instance, Jewish people, the majority of which, 97%, are not Christians. If they're Orthodox, they believe that the Messiah, he's still coming, but it's not Jesus who already came. And this is why. Because when Jesus came the first time, he fulfilled the law, and he fulfilled many of the prophets, all of the prophecies about the Lamb of God who would come and suffer and take away the sins of the world. But he did not fulfill the prophecies given in 2 Samuel chapter 7 about the one who would sit on the throne of David forever. And he did not fulfill the one that talked in Isaiah or in Ezekiel that talked about ruling the entire world from Jerusalem, where it would be such a time of peace that children could walk over holes where there were snakes and the snakes wouldn't jump up and bite them. That just his presence on the earth would create a peace that had never been seen before. And because he did not come the first time to fulfill these promises, they have rejected his salvation. But I need us to understand that when Jesus came the first time, he did not come to rule the earth. Rather, he came to save the earth. And when he came the first time to save the earth, it is because of that salvation that when he comes again to rule the earth, there will be people here to rule. Because if he didn't save us first, and he came just as the Lion of the tribe of Judah to rule, we would literally die in the moment the word came out of his mouth, because we could not stand in his presence. So when we see this moment in the book of Revelation chapter 20, when Jesus Christ comes to the earth and he opens his mouth as a sword and literally the nations die in front of him, if he did not come to save us first, we would be among those who fell. But thank God he came and saved us first, and then he ascended on high, and Jesus Christ is coming again. And when he comes again, he says that he will gather the nations to himself. This conversation forces us to embrace the importance of the nations. Now, because we do not live in every nation, but we live in this one, we are going to turn the attention of our conversation upon our nation, upon our families, upon the rules that govern us, and how those rules are in alignment with his rules or his laws. The first thing that Jesus will do is gather nations. What is important about a nation? What is a nation? From the gospel perspective, what is a nation? We see this all the way back in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 5. It says, "From these of the sons of Noah, the coastland peoples spread out into their lands, each with his own language by his clans in their nations." So we see three things that are important to a nation. The first being a boundary that separates their land from someone else's land. God recognizes boundaries. He recognizes national boundaries so that he can hold these people in this nation accountable for what they do, which does not affect the people that he holds accountable for what they do in this nation. Boundaries actually matter. The boundaries of your household matter. Your land and your house, God will judge based on what you do, but understand this, the ungodliness that is done in the house next to you, their judgment will not come upon you. Why? Because you said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So God recognizes the boundary of what is yours and the boundary of what is someone else's. When he calls a nation, he is saying it's this people inside of this boundary. This is what he said to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 13 and verse 14, it said, "The Lord said to Abram, lift up your eyes and look northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever." So God took Abraham to a place of significance that as far as he would see northward, which was as far as a place that would be called Dan, that was the boundary. And then he looked southward, as far south as he could see, which became a place called Beersheba. And then he said, "I want you to look as far east," and he saw to the Jordan River, and as far west, and he saw to the Mediterranean Sea. And he said, "Okay, Abraham, this, Dan to Beersheba, the Jordan to the Mediterranean, this is your boundary. This is your land. This is the nation that I'm promising to you." But he was also specific about the people who would fill that land. He gave him a child who was called the child of promise, Isaac. It was not one of his other children, but rather his child Isaac that he had with his wife Sarah. And God said, through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Through you, what I will do in you, through you, everyone else will be blessed. But it's important who he put in the land that he gave the boundary to. I want all of us to understand family matters. If there is a message that is being distorted and twisted and perverted in the United States of America today, it is family. We have come to a place where we celebrate every alternative form of family, and therefore we diminish and criticize what God established as family. And I'm not saying that there are not other families that exist in different ways and that we should help in every way that we can so that we can assist people live in the fullness of God. I'm not saying everybody gets it right all the time. I think we all know what a broken home looks like. But let that not take away from the providence and the glory and the position that God placed on what we call the nuclear family, where somebody fell in love with somebody and God made them one, and in the oneness of what God created, they had children, and God says, this is your household. And you have this lifetime commitment to them, and they have a lifetime commitment to you, and you will raise your children in the love of that commitment, and you will raise your children in the fear and the admonition of God. That isn't everybody's story. There are a whole bunch of you that have lived a whole bunch of life. But let me just say to every one of you that just said, I do, this is forever. And you need to have a house that God has called you to build that is so full of joy and so full of peace, nobody ever wants to go. I actually want to have to kick my kids out of the house because it's so awesome they never want to leave. I mean that. I don't want my kids to be scratching at the door at 16. Get me out of this house. No, I want to follow the gospel to such a level that they find the peace in my home that is security to them. The people matter. The boundary matters. Now, when we stop talking about just the household, we have to include national boundaries, and that conversation has gotten extremely divisive in our nation. And yet, at just the practical application of it, most of us all agree that we can only do so much. We only have so much resource. We can only help so many people. And so therefore, we should help all the people that we possibly can. But we cannot help more than we can help. And so as a nation, when that nation has determined that we can help this many more people than our own people who are in the boundary, and therefore, if you want to be one of the people that come in and become us, we can receive a whole bunch of you, but we can't receive everybody. Therefore, we will establish some rules that allow us to bring people in who otherwise would not be able to come in, and they will become one of us. And we show them the same dignity, we show them the same love, we show them the same resource. We open our doors wide because we have the capacity to do that. But we cannot give that same hospitality to someone whom we don't have room or resource for. And that is a conversation that every single family has to understand. Like, we know how many people we can bring in our house. Like, if the kids want to have a party, there's usually a limit to how many kids can come over. Why? Because the house or the apartment or the condo or the backyard is only so big. And I'll tell you what else there's a resource on of limitation: how much pizza we can buy, how much pizza we can carry in the car, how much pizza we want to carry in the car. That creates a limitation. that every family recognizes. We're about to go into the holidays. Every single one of you who have kids, you might have 2, 3, 4, you have a budget. And you'll take that budget and you will divide that budget to 2 or to 3 or to 4 or to 9. And you'll have to decide, how are you going to do that? And there might be some kids and you say, you know what? This kid over here, he just means something to me. I don't know, God just connected our hearts. So instead of it being 4 this year, it's gonna be 5. Instead of it being 5, it's gonna be 6. And I'm gonna give this to their parents so their parents can give it to them, because I don't even want the glory. I don't even want the thank you. I just love that little kid some way, somehow, that I want him to have something that if I didn't help, he wouldn't have it. Like, there should be a compassion and a sharing and a giving in all our hearts. But there's still a limit. And that limit will force us to make difficult decisions. And so in our nation, these are some of the budgetary decisions that have been made. There are billions of dollars that are spent on bringing people into this country legally who have a place at the table, who have gone through the long process, the arduous process, and they've come into this nation and they have assimilated, and they're one of us. We are one. There are also people who have chosen not to submit to those processes and to come into this nation illegally. And for those, we have not extended resources, except we have. And so when you look at line items on a budget and you see that the federal government is spending $66 billion on people who come into the nation illegally, and that doesn't seem to spark a desire to do more, to just say, okay, you can come in if you're in this category, but you're gonna have to stay out until you're in this category. You figure it out here. We can only take this many in. We've decided not to do that well, which is why we're having to budget $66 billion for people to come into the country illegally. Now, that may not sound like a lot of money to you, but let's put this in perspective. We just had a whole massive hurricane go through and just devastate our land from Florida through North Carolina. It's expensive to fix it. If anybody has looked at the pictures, it breaks your heart. Like, you know, I don't know if you've gone up through any of that area, especially in North Carolina. Like, that's a beautiful part of the country. And there are people who, like, they lost everything. They didn't, like, have a hole in the roof. Their house is in the lake 5 miles away from their land. Like, it just ended up down there. And so, like, we knew, at least the smart people suggested that we were gonna have a pretty active hurricane season this year. And so, in preparation for this, the federal government, the smart people in the federal government, they decided that they would allocate $18.8 billion to relief and reconstruction for the damage that they thought might happen. $66 billion for people to come in illegally and receive benefits. $18.8 billion for people who are here legally and got struck by disaster to receive benefits. And then, if you happen to be a veteran, we'll budget $3 billion for you. $3 billion, $18.8 billion, $66 billion. I feel like it's safe to say that our priorities might be askew. Now, that just forces us, to be responsible with whom God has given us and be more honest about how much room and how much resource we have for others to come in. And if that means, like if we have this much, then maybe we need to expand and open the door wider so that more people can come in legally. I'm not smart enough to know that answer. What I do know is you cannot keep supporting the illegal activity of people to come and disregard a boundary. That just doesn't seem right. And especially when those funds then can't be put in places that it is of great benefit to the people who live here, who God has called you to take care of. Because I want you to see something in this text that we miss a lot of times. He says, as you have done to the least of these, my brothers. Not just the least of these. We get this conversation in the gospel wrong all the time, and it forces us to spread ourselves so thin that we're no longer taking care of the people that God has called us to take care of, and we think we're fulfilling Scripture, and we're stressed and strained, and we don't have enough, and that was never God's intention with this text. He said, no, please understand, if they are your brothers, if they're in me, then just know I'm gonna bless them. And there may be a time that they fall on hard times. They may go through a hard season, but it's just a little short valley. And in that time of a little short valley, I need you who have more to help them, because I'm gonna lift them out of that place and I'm gonna set them up on higher ground. But they're gonna need a little assistance right here. But the person who's living in abject rebellion to the gospel of God, and they're living in an illegal manner, or they're living in an immoral manner, you can feed them and clothe them and shelter them for the rest of their lives, and all you'll do is enable them to go to hell. Now that might have been a little harsh, but it forces us to consider, what is our perspective? Why do I believe what I believe? Why do I have compassion where I have compassion? Is it godly compassion, or is it a deceived compassion? All right, 1 Timothy chapter, that's enough of me, the gospel. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. He says very clearly that you who do not take care of your relatives, and especially the members of your own household, you have denied the faith and are worse than an unbeliever. So he's forcing a hierarchy of care. He is forcing a hierarchy of concern. What he's saying is, you have to take care of your household first. That's that boundary that lives under the roof where you live and you sleep and you eat, your household. You have to take care of them first. He said, especially them. And with what you have remaining, then those who would qualify as relatives whom you can help. And then once you have done that, he's saying that you have not disregarded the gospel, that you have not disregarded your faith, but that you've cared for who you've been called to care for. Now this matters hugely to us because all of us have to make decisions in order to care for the people in our house. And sometimes there will be others who want something that we have to say no to. There are just those moments where we have to say no, and the reason why is because our family needs more than they have needed before, but they might need more right now. I know this is true of me with my time. This isn't just talking about resource. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, it's not just talking about resource. Sometimes in the gospel community, especially sort of hyper-masculine communities, we have used this to just say, this is all about guys making a whole bunch of money, and you just have to provide everything that your family ever has, and it's all on your shoulders. What it's saying is that you have to work harder than anybody else in your house. Your wife, she actually might make more money than you. She might actually have a certain giftedness that is rewarded by a certain economy more than your giftedness is rewarded by the economy that you're in. Thank God. Who cares? It's all coming into the house. Thank God for his blessing. But let me let you understand this, man. Do not interpret the resource that she is bringing in as an excuse for you to sit on the couch, put on your headphones, and play video games with your buddies. You might play video games with your friends when you have time. But let me just say, if she's outworking you, put the game console down, get up, go do something of value, add value to the house, go wax the car, go clean out the garage. I don't know. Work until you're exhausted and then come inside. And if you have any energy left in your thumbs, then enjoy that game. But you exhaust yourself first. First. He goes on. Wasn't just in 1 Timothy. To the Galatians, he said something similar, chapter 6 and verse 10. He said, so then, let us who have opportunity, meaning you have the means to do this, let us who have opportunities do good to everyone, especially those of the household of faith. These texts are forcing us to create hierarchy and understand where our first attention must go to our household. Then our attention, it goes into those in our nation. And when we have room outside, then we can help those outside, bring as many in as we can. But when we've reached that limit, we have to say no. And if we would stop providing shelter for people who shouldn't be here, they would stop coming, whoever they are, from wherever they're coming from. And we wouldn't have this problem anymore. We have to get to where we can actually have mature conversations. Because every single mom and dad actually understands this. Every single person, we all understand limitations. And we all work within them. So it's not irresponsible to expect and require our government to live within those same responsibilities. Our government shouldn't be spending all the money it doesn't have. If we don't spend all the money that we don't have, Proverbs is very, very clear. If you spend more than what you make all the time, you will become slave to the lender. Like, I've heard people say, oh, that means you shouldn't borrow money for a house. No, it doesn't mean that. Let me just give you the economics of buying a house. Because, I just think home ownership, we don't even consider this as much as we should anymore because I'll just go out there for a minute. Because we've taken the attention off of the family, now things like owning a home isn't a big deal anymore. We talk about, how much money it is. You can borrow $300,000 to buy a house, and that's a whole lot of money. And you're going to spend $347,000 over the next 30 years at 6% interest. That means you're going to spend $647,000 over 30 years for that house. And people are like, see, it's ridiculous. Yeah, sure. But that $647,000 that you just spent on that house is going to be worth $900,000 at the end of 3 years. So you actually made money. Or you could sit there and go rent something for more and more and more every year and spend $1 million in the same 30 years and have nothing. So let me just say, when we're talking about being slave to the lender, we're not talking about owning a home. We're talking about putting your coffee on a credit card. Stop. Stop. Our family matters. The boundaries of a nation matter. He says, I will gather the nations. And then he's going to give them laws. And God gave 613 laws to the children of Israel. This would be, we say we have a Judeo-Christian ethic in our law. This would be the Judeo part. God gave them 613 laws. It started with 10. This is probably typical. Any of you, at work, you make a rule, and then you realize you needed more rules, and then you needed more rules, or you have a rule in your house, hey, we're going to do this, and then, no, I don't mean that. And you have to keep adding rules. One of your kids says, hey, I'm going to run up to Lakeside Village. Sure, you can go to Lakeside Village, but be careful. You didn't think you needed to tell them, don't just spin donuts infinitely in the middle of South Florida Avenue. You didn't think you needed to say that. You just thought you needed to say, be careful on your way to Lakeside Village. Then you realize how they interpret be careful, which means you need to have a controlled spin in the intersection on South. So there's a sort of necessity for added rules from time to time. The Apostle Paul had this with the Galatians. He said, oh, hey, especially the Corinthians, he's like, you are not saved by works, but rather you're saved by grace through faith. And they said, great. Works don't matter, so we're going to continue living like we always lived before. And then he came in later and he said, whoa, no. I said you're free. I didn't say you're free. Do not use grace as an occasion to sin. Then he said, God forbid. When he said that, that was not an expression of frustration. That was a command. God forbid you use grace as an occasion to sin. Laws actually matter. Rules actually matter, and they have consequences. And so there are rules that will govern nations. We have rules that govern us. And here's what we have to see in this text. And I don't know that I saw this before, but I certainly see it now. He called the nations together, and then from each nation, he said, I'm going to separate the people into sheep and goats. He wasn't saying one people group, a nation, is better than a nation, is better than a nation, is better than a nation. He said, I'm going to take all of the nations and set them before me, and from every nation, I'm going to take those who are good and put them in the sheep section, and I'm going to take those who are not good, and I'm going to put them in the goat nation. And we have had this conversation almost to suggest that there are good nations and there are bad nations. And when we look at it like that, it will actually affect the way that we take the gospel into other places. Matthew 24:14 forces us to have a global mindset. It says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So we have the responsibility as Christians to take the gospel into every single nation that we have opportunity to take it. But let me just say this, before we can take it to one place, we have to take it to our own. And from the strength of the gospel that we have in our own nation, then from that strength, that we can pour the gospel into other nations. I'm not suggesting that missions is going to suddenly become irrelevant. What I am saying is we are living in a day and time where we actually need to draw a little more focus into our own community, into our own nation, and we need to make sure that the gospel is proliferating here and is growing here, because there is an advancement of evil in our nation that needs to stop. We are not better than someone else just because we are here. We are only better when we follow the laws that God has given us to follow. We see this in Romans chapter 2 and verse 9. God says, there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, for the Jew first and also the Greek. But there will be peace and there will be glory and there will be honor for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. For God shows no partiality. What that means is, if I'm living in a nation like Russia that is acting in a awful way against the people of Ukraine, if I'm in that nation, even though my nation may be doing something vastly ungodly, if I stand for truth in that nation, when God gathers the nation, He will bring me with the sheep that He puts on His left side. So it doesn't matter what side of the tracks you were born in. It doesn't matter where you came from. It doesn't matter what nation you came from. God considers all of our work to be the only thing that He's going to judge us by. He's not judging you by your neighbor. He's not judging you by your city. He's not judging you by your nation. He's judging you by the standard of the gospel that He has given you. There aren't sheep and goat nations, but there are sheep and goat people. And we desire to be people that God would call sheep and place on His right hand. So when we sort of embrace this reality, then what we realize is the sun shines on the just and the unjust. But we, as Christians, have sometimes leaned into an idea that if somebody has prosperity, then that means God is blessing them. Let me just speak to that for a minute. When the Spirit of God was removed from the earth back in the book of Genesis because of all the evil, there was an advancement of ancient civilizations that stopped. And then we just kind of plugged along. And we did pretty good. I mean, just not great. But then from the moment that Jesus Christ was resurrected and ascended on high and the Holy Spirit was poured out upon the earth, we stepped into a period of time that Daniel in chapter 12 said would be a time of great increase of knowledge. And when you look at the advancement in humanity, in science and technology and engineering and mathematics and art and all of the things, we have we have exponential increase since Christianity has been on the planet. Why? Because God blesses people who love him. And there are persons, it was St. Augustine of Hippo who said it like this: all truth is God's truth. There are people who tap into a truth that gives great blessing to the people of God. Does it give them blessing too? Yes, but even the sinner will have increase so that God can bless you. Like you might have an ungodly boss, but God will bless him or her to bless you. Why? Because he made you a promise. And so I'm not going to, but here's where we have to be careful. I'm not going to get distracted and think because their reward or their prosperity is greater than mine, it must mean that God is blessing them. So I'm going to adopt their values, their morals, their politics, their ideas, because I want all this stuff. No. I want Jesus more than I want anything. But because of prosperity, we have found ourselves in a place where we are misunderstanding the world in which we are living. And we have to be careful. We have to be careful. Because let me just say this. There was a time when there was greater prosperity in our nation. And today, that prosperity is dwindling. Why? Because there are less of us who are following Jesus than there used to be. If you want your nation to increase, you need to see the kingdom of God increase. Like, let's look at it like this. Let's just put it in political terms for just a minute. Maybe this will help. My parents, 61% of people in my parents' generation, they voted red. 61%. Today, people who are younger than me, 66% of them vote blue. So the generation who's older than me voted red. The generation younger than me voted blue. What created the shift? It wasn't economics, because economics were already good, actually very good. If you just sort of want to run the numbers and you looked at this generation, my parents' generation, when they were 35, and then you want to look at the average 35-year-old today, what you're going to find is their wealth would have been worth $100,000 at that age. Theirs is worth $65,000 at the same age. So they, at the same time, did better than them. But why? There was a morality that had not become, let me say it like this, there was an immorality that had not become national yet. People just lived by a different set of values in 1960 and 70. They just lived by different values. We can talk about free love, we can talk about all sure, but generally speaking, the nation as a majority didn't live that way. People stayed together. People raised their kids. People cared about family. People took their kids to church on Sunday. They lived differently. And then there was a shift in morality where we began to make fun of family values. Like I remember when I was coming of age, Bill Clinton was he was the dude. Bill Clinton was like, everybody loved Bill Clinton. Don't look at me like that. Everybody loved Bill Clinton. He'd talk, he'd get that thumb going. The guy was awesome. Everybody loved it. If it didn't work, he'd pull a saxophone out and he'd just play. People would cry. It was awesome. Everybody loved, the girls loved Bill Clinton. He loved them back. It was a fun time. It was a blast until it wasn't. And then all of a sudden, we began adopting as a nation a very fringe immorality. And when we did that, it's not that one economic policy was so much worse than another, because if you really do the math, both parties spend so much more money than have any business spending. So we can't really just point those kind of fingers. But here's what we can see. There is, whether lived or not, there is a morality that is being stood for on the right that is not being stood for on the left. And as we have adopted the politicians of the left in order to advance the immorality of the left, we have removed the blessing of God upon many in our nation. And you may not look at it this way, but blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And so, economic policy notwithstanding, when you remove the blessing of God from people, you remove prosperity. And we right now are in a hard spot where we are trying to have both prosperity and immorality, and we will never have it. But this text gives me hope as an individual, because he says, no, I'm gonna take the ones on my right and I'm going to call them sheep. And the ones whom I call sheep, they are going to have glory, and they're going to have honor, and they're going to have peace. So I can believe that in my house, I will have all of those things, regardless of the direction of the nation, because I will follow God. But, it will not be enough for me and my house, because I want to see more people experience the goodness of God. I want to see more people experience the glory of God. I want to see more people experience honor and peace in their homes. And so that means that I have to stand not upon a political platform, but I have to stand upon the rock of the gospel and say, this is what God says about this. And when we do what God says about this, then we will see his blessing. Let me wrap it up with this. There was a young queen, actually, in the house of a foreign king. Her name was Esther. And she had an opportunity that she didn't have the boldness to move on. She just didn't know what to do. There were laws in place that kept her from being as influential as she could be. Romans chapter 13 and verse 1 says, let each person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by him. So we're told to be obedient to authority. But then we also see in Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, where the apostles and Peter said to those in leadership, they said, we must obey God rather than men. So there does come a time where we have to stand up on the principles of the gospel no matter what the law around us is. And this is where Esther found herself. This is the place where she was. She said, I don't know what to do. And so her uncle sent a letter and he said, let me tell you something. If you remain silent, Esther, deliverance and relief for the Jews will rise from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. God isn't limited to us. That's right. But man, I love that he includes us. He said, look, I'm gonna perform my word whether you participate or not. And then he said, or how do you know if you are not in the kingdom for such a time as this? And then she said, okay, you go call my family together and you guys hold a fast on my behalf and do not eat or drink for 3 days. And she said, I'm going to gather the young women together and we're going to do the same exact thing. And then, and only then, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, then I perish. It just reminds me maybe of a national moment here where up in Virginia, Patrick Henry had this moment to have a conversation. And he said, no, I'm not going to the Capitol and have that conversation there. I'm going to have this conversation over in the church where I know the good people are. And he gathered a bunch of people in the church and he gives this soaring conversation. And at the end of it, he stands up and he says, give me liberty or give me death. And we find ourselves at a moment in church history in the United States of America where we have the opportunity to stand upon the rock of the gospel, where we have the opportunity to say, let evil do evil, but let good do good. We have the opportunity to stand up by faith on the principles of the Word of God and say, we will not stand for this anymore. We will lift up our voices. We will raise our votes. We will do everything that we possibly can to stand for family, to stand for morality, to stand for the goodness of God, that we in the United States of America will see the goodness of God in the land of the living.